I still remember the day I married Tessa Langford, standing there in my rented tuxedo, feeling like the luckiest guy alive. She looked stunning in her white dress, smiling at me like I was her whole world. But as soon as we stepped into her family's orbit, I knew something was off. Her mother, Judith, greeted me with this tight-lipped smile, the kind you give a stranger who's overstayed their welcome. It wasn't warm or real. It was a mask she wore to keep things polite. I could feel her eyes sizing me up, like I was some cheap knockoff she wished Tessa hadn't picked up at the store. Then there was Grant, her brother, lounging in the corner with a beer in his hand, smirking at me like he knew something I didn't. Miles used to love these family parties, he'd say, dropping Tessa's ex-husband's name every chance he got. It was like a little jab, a reminder that I didn't measure up. Tessa would just laugh it off, brushing her hand against my arm. "Oh, they're just old school," she'd say, her voice light and teasing. "Don't take it personally." But I did. How could I not? Every time we visited her family, it was the same thing: Judith with her fake politeness, Grant with his smug comments, and Tessa acting like it was all some big joke. I'd sit there at their fancy dinners, pushing food around my plate, trying to make small talk while they traded stories about Miles like he was some golden ghost they couldn't let go of. "Miles knew how to handle the boat," Grant would say, grinning at me as if I'd never touched a lake in my life. "Miles always brought the best wine," Judith would add, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. I'd nod and force a smile, but inside, my stomach twisted. I wasn't stupid. To them, I was a downgrade, a guy who didn't fit into their polished, perfect world. I'd grown up in a small house with a dad who fixed cars and a mom who worked double shifts at the diner. The Langfords? They had estates, investments, and a family name they treated like a royal title. Tessa was the only reason I kept showing up. She'd squeeze my hand under the table or whisper something silly in my ear, and for a moment, I'd think maybe I was overreacting. She loved me, didn't she? That's what I told myself every time I caught Judith staring at me like I was dirt on her shoe or Grant chuckling at some private joke about Miles. But the truth was creeping in, slow and steady, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I wasn't just an outsider to them, I was a mistake. And the worst part? I was starting to wonder if they were right. I'd lie awake at night next to Tessa, listening to her soft breathing, asking myself how long I could keep pretending I belonged in her life. Her family didn't want me here, and no amount of her laughter could cover that up. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but I wasn't ready to spit it out just yet. I loved her too much, or maybe I was too stubborn to admit defeat. Either way, I kept showing up, hoping one day they'd see me as more than the guy who wasn't Miles. But deep down, I knew it was a losing battle. The Langfords had already made up their minds, and I was the odd man out, stuck on the outside looking in. Thanksgiving rolled around, and I wasn't exactly jumping for joy when Tessa begged me to go with her to Judith's big estate for the Langford family dinner. I'd rather have stayed home with a frozen pizza and a beer, but she gave me those pleading eyes, and I caved. "It's tradition, Brandon," she said, her voice all sweet and convincing. "It'll be fun." Fun wasn't the word I'd use as we pulled up to that sprawling mansion, all stone pillars and perfectly trimmed hedges. I felt like a fish out of water, tugging at my too-tight sweater while Tessa breezed ahead in her fancy coat. The place smelled like money, old money, and I could feel every pair of eyes on me as we stepped inside. Judith met us at the door, her smile as stiff as ever, and ushered us into the grand dining room. That's when my heart dropped right into my boots. The table was set like something out of a magazine, all crystal glasses and folded napkins, but there was one thing that stuck out like a sore thumb, a place card with Miles written on it in Judith's neat little handwriting. Every name was handwritten, every seat picked on purpose, and there it was, Miles, Tessa's ex, still holding a spot at the table like he'd never left. I stood there, staring at it, my throat tightening up. Judith caught my look and gave me that sugary smile of hers. "We like to honor tradition," she said, her voice smooth as silk but cold as ice. I glanced at Tessa, hoping she'd say something, anything to make it less humiliating, but she just smirked, a cruel little twist on her lips. "Mom thinks you should sign now," she said, casual as if she were asking me to pass the salt. Then she slid an envelope onto my plate, right next to the mashed potatoes. My hand shook as I opened it, and there they were, divorce papers, already signed by her in that loopy cursive she used for everything. I couldn't breathe for a second. The room felt too big and too small all at once, the chatter of her family fading into a dull buzz. I looked around the table, Grant smirking like he'd won a bet, Judith sipping her wine like nothing was wrong, and Tessa just watching me, waiting to see what I'd do. It wasn't just a dinner, it was a setup. They'd planned this, all of them, to shove me out the door with a turkey leg in my hand. My chest burned with embarrassment, but I swallowed it down. I wanted to flip the table, yell at them, ask Tessa how she could do this after everything we'd been through. But I didn't. I just sat there, the envelope heavy in my lap, feeling like the dumbest guy alive for thinking I could ever fit in with these people. The food smelled amazing, roast turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, but it might as well have been cardboard to me. I couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. Judith kept talking about some old Thanksgiving story, something about Miles and a hunting trip, and Grant chimed in with a laugh. They were acting like I wasn't even there, like I'd already signed those papers and walked out. Tessa reached for her glass, her fingers brushing mine for a second, and I pulled away. That touch used to mean something to me, but now it felt like a lie. I kept my eyes on that place card, Miles, and wondered how long they'd been planning this. Had Tessa been laughing at me behind my back the whole time? Was this why Judith always looked at me like I was trash? My head was spinning, but I didn't say a word. Not yet. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I just sat there, the divorce papers burning a hole through my plate, knowing this wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was the end of everything I'd been fighting to hold on to. I sat there at that ridiculous Thanksgiving table, the taste of humiliation bitter in my mouth, staring at those divorce papers Tessa had slid onto my plate like it was no big deal. Judith was still droning on about some old family story. Grant was chuckling like a smug jerk, and Tessa just watched me with that cold smirk, waiting for me to crack. But I wasn't going to give them that. No way. I'd had enough of their games, their little digs, their precious Miles haunting me like a ghost they couldn't bury. My hand went to my pocket, and I pulled out my phone, keeping my face as calm as I could manage. If tradition matters so much, I said, my voice steady even though my insides were shaking, let's honor this one truth. I tapped the screen, and the room went dead quiet as a voicemail started playing. It was Miles, his voice rough and annoyed, filling the air like a bomb going off. Tessa, stop dragging me into your family schemes. I'm not getting back with you. I don't care what your mother thinks. The words hung there, heavy and ugly, and I watched every face at that table change. Judith's fork hit her plate with a loud clatter, her perfect mask slipping as her eyes went wide. Grant's wine glass slipped from his hand, splashing red all over the white tablecloth, his smirk gone like it had been wiped clean off. Tessa's mouth opened, then shut, like a fish gasping for air. I leaned back in my chair, folding those stupid divorce papers in my hands, and gave them a small, tight smile. Care to explain? I asked, keeping my tone light, like I was asking about the weather. Nobody said a word. Judith's face turned red, then white, her hands gripping the edge of the table like she might snap it in half. Grant stared at the floor, suddenly real interested in the carpet, and Tessa just looked at me, her eyes darting around like she was trying to find a lie fast enough to save herself. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I kept it locked down. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about them, all of them, and the little world they built where I was the fool. That voicemail wasn't even meant for me. Miles had called my number by mistake 2 nights ago, probably drunk or tired, and left it there like a gift I didn't know I'd need. I'd listened to it over and over, sitting in the dark of our living room, wondering what it meant. Now I knew. They'd been plotting to shove me out and pull Miles back in, like I was some placeholder they could toss aside. Tessa's smirk was gone now, replaced by this panicked look I'd never seen before, and it felt good, real good, to see her squirm. Judith finally found her voice, stammering something about misunderstandings, but it was weak, and nobody bought it, not even her. Grant muttered under his breath, something about Miles being an idiot, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. I just sat there, letting the silence stretch out, letting them feel the weight of what they'd done. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady as I tucked the phone back in my pocket. I didn't yell, didn't curse them out, even though I wanted to. I just looked at Tessa, right into those eyes I used to love, and waited. She didn't say anything, didn't try to explain, and that said more than any words could. The food was getting cold on the table, the turkey sitting there untouched, but I didn't care. This wasn't about dinner anymore. It was about me finally seeing the truth they'd tried to hide, Judith pulling strings, Tessa playing along, Grant cheering from the sidelines. I wasn't the downgrade they thought I was. I was the guy who just turned their little game upside down, and they didn't know what to do about it. I didn't stick around after dropping that voicemail bomb on Tessa and her family. The air in that dining room was thick with shock and lies, and I couldn't breathe it anymore. I grabbed my coat, walked out the front door of Judith's fancy estate, and let the cold November air hit me like a slap. My truck was parked down the drive, and I was halfway there when my phone buzzed again. I almost ignored it, figured it was Tessa trying to spin some excuse, but the number was unknown. I hesitated, then picked up. "Hello," I said, my voice rough from holding everything in. A woman's voice came through, shaky and nervous. "Hi, is this Brandon? My name's Marina. I think you deserve to know. I've been seeing Tessa for over a year. She told me the divorce was mutual. I just found out about tonight. I had no idea." I stopped walking, my boots crunching on the gravel, my brain trying to catch up. "A year? Another woman?" I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, but I kept my tone even. "Where are you?" I asked. She gave me an address, Tessa's apartment, the one she kept downtown for work trips. "I'm outside," Marina said. "I need to see this through." I didn't even think about it. "I'm coming," I told her, then hung up and got in my truck. The drive was a blur, my hands tied on the wheel, my mind racing. Tessa had been cheating, not just plotting with her family, but living a whole other life. And this Marina woman? She sounded as blindsided as me. When I pulled up to the apartment building, I saw her standing there under a streetlight, short dark hair, arms crossed, looking pissed and hurt all at once. She spotted me and walked over, her breath puffing out in the cold. "You're Brandon?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, you're Marina?" She gave a sharp nod back, her jaw tight. "I didn't know about you until an hour ago. She's been texting me all night, acting like everything's fine." I almost laughed, but it came out more like a grunt. "Yeah, well, she just handed me divorce papers at her mom's Thanksgiving dinner, so I'd say she's full of surprises." Marina's eyes widened, then narrowed. "What a piece of work," she muttered. We stood there for a second, two strangers tied together by Tessa's mess, and I felt this weird mix of anger and relief. At least I wasn't the only one she'd played. "You want to confront her?" I asked, jerking my head toward the building. Marina didn't hesitate. "Hell yes." We went up together, the elevator ride quiet except for the hum of the motor. My stomach was in knots, but I wasn't backing down. When we got to Tessa's door, I didn't knock. I still had a key. I turned it in the lock, pushed the door open, and there she was, sprawled on the couch like nothing was wrong, texting away on her phone. She didn't even look up at first, just smiled and said, "Hey, you're early." Then her head snapped up, and her face went slack when she saw me standing there with Marina right beside me. "Babe," she started, her voice wobbling, but I cut her off, crossing my arms. "Which one of us are you talking to?" I asked, keeping my tone flat. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked from me to Marina, then back again, her phone slipping from her hand onto the cushion. I could see the panic setting in, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. Marina stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You told me he was out of the picture. You said it was mutual." Tessa stammered. I can explain, but I didn't want to hear it. Not yet. I just stood there, watching her squirm, feeling the ground shift under me. This wasn't the woman I'd married. Or maybe it was, and I'd just been too blind to see it. Either way, I wasn't alone in this mess anymore. Marina was here, and we were about to get some answers. I stood there in Tessa's apartment, arms crossed, staring at her as she fumbled for words on that fancy couch of hers. The place smelled like her perfume, sweet and sharp, and it made my stomach turn. Marina was next to me, her fists clenched, looking just as ready to explode as I felt. Tessa's eyes bounced between us, wide and frantic, like she'd been caught with her hand in the cookie jar and didn't know how to lie her way out. "Babe," she started again, but I didn't let her finish. "Which one of us are you talking to?" I repeated, my voice low and steady, though inside I was a mess. She froze, her phone still lying there on the cushion like it might save her. Before she could come up with some half-baked excuse, the door flew open behind us, banging against the wall so hard I jumped. Judith stormed in, her face twisted with anger, Grant right on her heels looking confused and annoyed. "What is going on here?" Judith snapped, her eyes landing on Marina like she was some kind of intruder. "Who is this?" Tessa shot up from the couch, smoothing her hair like that would fix everything. "Mom, it's fine. I can handle," but Judith wasn't having it. She pointed a shaky finger at Marina. "This wasn't part of the real plan," she barked, her voice loud enough to echo off the high ceilings. I frowned, trying to piece that together, but Grant beat me to it. He stepped forward, his brow furrowed, looking at his mom like she'd lost her mind. "What plan? What are you talking about?" Judith ignored him, glaring at Marina instead. You were supposed to be gone by now. Tessa was bringing Miles back. My head spun. Miles again? I glanced at Tessa, who was turning red, her hands twisting together. Marina let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Miles? Are you kidding me? She's been with me for a year. Judith's mouth dropped open, and Grant just stood there, blinking like he'd walked into the wrong movie. I took a step forward, feeling the room tilt under me. So let me get this straight, I said, keeping my voice calm even though my blood was boiling. You and your mom cooked up some scheme to ditch me for Miles, and all this time, Tessa's been playing house with Marina too? Tessa opened her mouth, but nothing came out, just a little whimper. Judith turned on me, her eyes blazing. You were never right for her, Brandon. We needed stability, someone who fits. I almost laughed at that. Fits? Like I was a pair of shoes that didn't match her outfit. Marina cut in, her voice shaking with fury. And what about me? She told me she loved me, that you two were done. Tessa finally found her voice, weak as it was. I didn't mean for it to get this messy. But Grant interrupted, his face hard. Messy? Tessa, you've been lying to everyone. Mom, you too. What the hell is wrong with you? Judith spun on him, her voice rising. Don't you dare talk to me like that. I was fixing things. Fixing things. That's what she called it. I looked around, at Tessa's panicked face, Judith's rage, Grant's disgust, Marina's hurt, and it hit me. This whole family was a house of mirrors, all twisted reflections and fake fronts. I've been trying to see myself in it, to find a place, but it was all smoke and tricks. Tessa sank back onto the couch, her hands covering her face, and Judith kept yelling, something about loyalty and legacy, but it was just noise to me now. Grant shook his head, stepping back like he wanted out. Marina crossed her arms tighter, staring at Tessa like she could burn a hole through her. And me? I just stood there, watching it all fall apart, feeling the weight of every lie they'd fed me. This wasn't my mess to clean up, not anymore. I'd been the outsider, sure, but now I could see the truth. They were the ones lost in their own game. I stood in the middle of Tessa's apartment, the chaos swirling around me like a storm I couldn't escape. Judith was still yelling, her voice sharp and shrill, while Grant looked like he wanted to bolt, and Marina's glare could have melted steel. Tessa was slumped on the couch, her face in her hands, like hiding would make this all go away. I'd had enough of their shouting and excuses. I needed to cut through the noise. I pulled out my phone again, my fingers steady even though my heart was racing. Let's add one more thing to the pile, I said, loud enough to make them all stop and look at me. I hit play on another voicemail I'd been sitting on, this one from Tessa's financial advisor. The guy's voice came through, calm and professional, but every word landed like a brick. Tessa, it's Mark. We've identified several inconsistencies in the joint accounts. Multiple secret transfers. High-end purchases. If this continues, legal action may be necessary. The room went silent, dead silent, like someone had sucked all the air out of it. Judith's face drained of color, her mouth hanging open mid-rant. Marina let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Grant's jaw dropped, his eyes darting to Tessa, who still wouldn't look up. I turned to her, keeping my voice even, though I wanted to shout. So while you were plotting my exit with your family, you were also draining our accounts and dating someone else? She didn't answer, just sat there, her shoulders shaking. I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears, but I wasn't going to lose it, not yet. Judith exploded first, her voice cracking. This is outrageous. How could you be so reckless, Tessa? I almost laughed at that, Judith acting like she wasn't part of this whole mess. Marina stepped closer, her eyes locked on Tessa. You used me and stole from him? What kind of person are you? Tessa finally lifted her head, her eyes red and wet, but I didn't feel sorry for her, not one bit. I didn't mean to, she started, but Grant cut her off, his voice low and angry. Don't even try it, Tess. You meant every damn thing you did. I watched her squirm, her hands twisting in her lap, and it hit me how deep this went. Those joint accounts were ours, mine and hers, money I'd worked my ass off for, money we'd saved together. And she'd been siphoning it off, probably for months, maybe longer, spending it on who knows what while she played her little games. I thought about the late nights she'd said were work, the weekends she'd disappeared to this apartment, the way she'd brush off my questions with a smile. It wasn't just betrayal, it was theft, cold and calculated. Judith turned on me, her finger jabbing the air. You can't prove anything. This is all nonsense. But I held up a hand, stopping her. I've got the bank logs, Judith. I've got the voicemail. I've got more than enough. Her mouth snapped shut, and for once, she didn't have a comeback. Grant rubbed his face, muttering something I couldn't catch, but I didn't care. My eyes stayed on Tessa, waiting for her to say something, anything, that might make sense of this. She didn't. She just sat there, silent, like a kid caught sneaking candy who knows the game's up. Marina shook her head, her voice breaking. I trusted you, Tessa. I thought we had something real. That stung me too, in a weird way. I wasn't the only one she'd hurt. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closing in with all their lies and secrets. I tucked my phone back in my pocket, feeling the weight of what I'd just done. This wasn't just about catching her, it was about showing them I wasn't the pushover they thought. I'd been collecting proof for weeks, little things I'd noticed that didn't add up, and now it was all out there. Tessa's tears didn't move me anymore. She'd built this mess, and I was done trying to fix it for her. The air in Tessa's apartment was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I stood there, watching her cry into her hands, but I didn't feel an ounce of pity, not after that voicemail, not after everything. Judith was pacing now, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, her face twisted up like she couldn't decide who to blame. Marina was still fuming, her arms crossed tight, and Grant looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Then Judith spun on me, her eyes wild. This is your fault, Brandon, she shouted, pointing that bony finger again. You pushed her into this. You never fit with us. I just stared at her, letting her words bounce off me. She was grasping at straws, and we all knew it. She turned to Marina next, her voice dripping with venom. And you, what are you even doing here? This is a family matter. Marina fired back, her voice sharp. Family? She lied to me too, Judith. I'm not the one stealing money and cheating on people. Judith's face went red, but before she could snap again, Grant stepped in, his voice loud and tired. Enough, Mom. You manipulated all of us. You tried to push Miles back into the picture behind everyone's back, and Tessa's been cheating the whole time on Brandon, on Marina, on everyone. Judith froze, her mouth open, but no words came out. It was like Grant had finally said what we'd all been thinking, and it hit her hard. Tessa looked up, her face streaked with tears, and tried to reach for him. Grant, please, but he shook his head, stepping back. No, Tessa. I'm done covering for you. Marina jumped in, her voice breaking as she glared at Tessa. And I actually thought she loved me. I was an idiot to believe her. I watched it all unfold, feeling like I was outside my own body for a second. This family, this perfect little Langford world, was cracking wide open, and I'd lit the fuse. Judith started shouting again, something about loyalty and how we were all ruining everything, but it was just noise now. Grant turned away, rubbing his neck like he was exhausted, and Marina's eyes stayed locked on Tessa, hurt and furious. That's when I felt the words bubbling up, the ones I'd been holding back too long. I took a deep breath and said, loud and clear, I'm pressing charges. The room went dead quiet again, like I'd flipped a switch. Tessa's head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. What? She whispered, like she couldn't believe it. Judith stopped pacing, staring at me like I'd grown a second head. You can't do that, she sputtered. Oh, I can, I said, keeping my voice calm. Fraud, theft, identity manipulation, I've got the proof. Bank records, voicemails, everything. This isn't just a family spat anymore. Marina nodded, her jaw tight. Good. She deserves it. Grant didn't say anything, just looked at me with something like respect, or maybe relief. Tessa started sobbing harder, shaking her head. Brandon, please, don't do this. I'll fix it, I swear, but I cut her off, my tone cold. You had your chance to fix it, Tessa. You chose this instead. Judith lunged forward, grabbing my arm. You'll destroy her. You'll destroy us. I pulled away, meeting her eyes. You did that yourselves. Nobody moved for a long moment. The shouting was gone, replaced by this heavy, suffocating silence. Tessa's cries were the only sound, soft and pathetic, but they didn't touch me. I'd spent too long trying to fit into their world, taking their jabs, swallowing their lies. Now they were seeing what happened when I stopped playing nice. Grant finally spoke, his voice low. She's right, Mom. Tessa did this. Not Brandon. Judith glared at him, but he didn't back down. Marina wiped her eyes, looking at me. I'm glad you're doing this, she said quietly. I nodded, feeling the weight of it settle on me. Pressing charges wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking back what was mine, my life, my dignity. I was done being their punching bag. I didn't waste time after saying I'd press charges. The words were barely out of my mouth when I pulled out my phone and dialed the police, right there in Tessa's apartment with everyone staring at me like I'd lost my mind. Judith's face was a mix of shock and fury. Marina stood tense and quiet, and Grant just watched, his expression hard to read. Tessa was still on the couch, crying into her hands, but I didn't look at her too long. Those tears weren't going to change anything. The operator picked up, and I kept my voice steady as I told her I needed officers at the address for fraud and theft. Yes, I've got evidence, I said, glancing at the stack of papers I'd pulled from my jacket. Bank logs, screenshots, those voicemails saved on my phone. I'd been gathering it all for weeks, little pieces I couldn't ignore anymore, and now it was paying off. The operator told me to stay put, and I hung up, feeling the room shift around me. Judith snapped out of her daze and lunged at me again. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't dare," she hissed, but I held up the papers, letting her see the proof with her own eyes. "It's done, Judith. Sit down." She didn't, of course. She started pacing again, muttering about lawyers and how I'd regret this. Grant grabbed her arm, his voice low. "Mom, stop. It's over." She shook him off, but he didn't push, just stepped back and let her rant. Marina gave me a small nod, like she was glad someone was finally doing something. The wait wasn't long. Maybe 10 minutes later, I heard sirens outside, and then a knock at the door. 2 officers stepped in, a man and a woman, both looking serious but calm. "We got a call about financial fraud?" the woman asked, her eyes scanning the room. I nodded, stepping forward. "That's me. Brandon. This is my wife, Tessa. She's been stealing from our joint accounts. I've got records, voicemails, everything." I handed over the stack, watching as the male officer flipped through it, his brow furrowing. Tessa finally stood up, her voice shaky. "This is a misunderstanding. I can explain," but the female officer held up a hand. "Ma'am, we'll hear you out, but we need to see this first." They listened to the financial advisor's voicemail, checked the bank logs showing transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, purchases for jewelry and trips I'd never seen. Tessa tried to spin a story, something about emergencies and bad advice, but it fell apart fast. The officers exchanged a look, and the man pulled out handcuffs. "Tessa Langford, you're under arrest for suspected financial fraud and identity manipulation," he said, his tone flat. She panicked, backing away. "No, wait, please. Brandon, tell them." I didn't say a word, just watched as they cuffed her, her wrist looking small and pale against the metal. Judith rushed forward, shouting, "You can't take her. She's my daughter." But Grant stepped between them, his voice firm. "Enough, Mom. She did this to herself." The officers didn't flinch. They'd probably seen worse family fights than this. They led Tessa out, her head down, her sobs echoing in the hall. Judith sank onto the couch, her hands shaking, muttering about how this couldn't be happening. Marina stayed quiet, watching it all like she was still processing. I took a deep breath, feeling the air clear a little now that Tessa was gone. The male officer turned to me. "We'll need you to come to the station for a full statement." I nodded. "Yeah, I'll be there." They left, and the apartment felt empty, like a storm had blown through and taken half the furniture with it. Grant looked at me, his eyes tired. "You okay?" he asked. I shrugged. "Getting there." He didn't say more, just grabbed his coat and walked out, leaving Judith sitting there alone. Marina lingered, her voice soft. "Thanks for this." She needed to face it. I managed a small smile. "Yeah, so did I." Then I walked out too, the weight lifting off my chest with every step. No yelling, no big scene, just freedom starting to sink in. After Tessa got hauled off in handcuffs, the days blurred together a little, but I didn't mind. The apartment was quiet without her, too quiet sometimes, but it gave me space to think, to figure out what came next. I didn't hear much at first, just bits and pieces from the police about the investigation. Then the news hit hard. Tessa was officially charged with financial fraud, forgery, and a couple other things I didn't even know were crimes. The evidence I'd given them, the bank logs, the voicemails, turned out to be a goldmine. They found more, too, stuff I hadn't even known about, like fake accounts in my name she'd used to funnel money. It made my head spin, thinking how long she'd been at it, how blind I'd been. Marina didn't waste time either. She filed her own complaint, claiming Tessa had scammed her out of cash under the guise of investments for their future. I didn't know the details, but I wasn't surprised. Tessa had a way of making people trust her, and she'd burned us both. Judith's world took a bigger hit than I expected. Word got around fast in their fancy social circle. People love a scandal, and suddenly the Langfords weren't the untouchable family anymore. I heard from an old buddy who still ran in those circles that Judith's invitations dried up. Her charity events got canceled, and folks started whispering behind her back. She'd built her whole life on that reputation, and now it was crumbling like a house of cards. Grant didn't stick around to watch it fall. He packed up and moved out of state, somewhere quiet where no one knew the Langford name. He didn't call, didn't text, just left a note with my buddy saying he was done with the drama. I couldn't blame him. One day, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't expect. Miles. I stared at it for a minute before opening it. Hey, Brandon. I never wanted any of this. You didn't deserve it. Glad you stood your ground. It was short, simple, but it hit me harder than I thought it would. Miles, the guy they'd all wanted back, didn't even want to be in the game. I didn't write back, just let it sit there, a little piece of closure I hadn't asked for. I got to work on the divorce, filing it on my terms this time. No pre-signed papers from Tessa, no games, just me, a lawyer, and a stack of evidence that made it airtight. The judge didn't mess around. With the fraud charges piling up, Tessa's lawyers couldn't fight much. I won a settlement, big enough to make my eyes pop when I saw the number. Her assets were frozen, locked down by the courts, and whatever she'd stashed away was getting clawed back. The Langford empire, Judith's pride and joy, was shrinking fast, and I didn't feel a bit sorry for them. I spent a lot of nights just sitting on my couch, a beer in my hand, staring at the wall and letting it all sink in. I'd been the outsider, the guy they'd laughed at, but I'd walked away with my head up. Tessa was facing jail time. Her trial was set for next month, and Judith couldn't buy her way out of this one. Marina called once, just to check in. You doing okay? She asked, her voice softer than it had been that night. Yeah, I said. You? She laughed a little, bitter but real. Getting there. She's not worth the tears. We didn't talk long, but it felt good knowing someone else got it. Someone else had made it out of Tessa's mess. I moved my stuff out of our old place, sold what I didn't need, and started looking for something new. Somewhere that didn't carry her ghost in every corner. The settlement money sat in my account, a safety net I hadn't had before, but I wasn't rushing to spend it. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe, like the future wasn't just a shadow of the Langford's plans. They tried to break me, but I was the one still standing. I settled into my new place. A sleek little apartment downtown with big windows and a view of the city skyline that made me feel like I'd finally landed somewhere solid. It wasn't fancy like Judith's estate, but it was mine, paid for with cash from the settlement and a chunk of my own savings. No more ghosts of Tessa or her family lurking in the corners, just clean lines, a comfy couch, and a quiet I could live with. I'd been there a couple weeks, still unpacking boxes, when the buzzer rang one evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I checked the camera. Marina stood there, hands in her pockets, looking up at the lens with a half smile. I buzzed her in, curious but not nervous. We weren't friends, not really, but we'd been through the same war. She stepped inside, glancing around at the bare walls and the stack of books I hadn't shelved yet. Nice place, she said, her voice easy. Cleaner than mine. I chuckled, rubbing the back of my neck. Still a work in progress. You want a drink? She nodded. God, yes. I grabbed 2 glasses and a bottle of bourbon from the kitchen counter. Nothing fancy, just something smooth I'd picked up to celebrate moving in. We sat on the couch, the city lights twinkling outside, and I poured us each a shot. To surviving, she said, raising her glass. I clinked mine against hers. To freedom, I added, and we both drank. The burn felt good, warm and steady, like it was washing away the last bits of Tessa's mess. We weren't dating, weren't even close to that, just 2 people who'd been chewed up by the same storm and spit out on the other side. Marina leaned back, swirling her glass. Heard Tessa's trial got pushed back. More evidence or something. I nodded, not surprised. Yeah, they keep finding new stuff. She dug herself deep. Marina snorted. Good. Let her sit in it. I didn't argue, couldn't, really. Tessa had made her choices, and I was done feeling guilty about them. We sipped our drinks in silence for a bit, the kind that didn't need filling with chatter. Outside, the city hummed, cars honking, lights flickering, life going on, and I felt it in my bones. I was part of that now, not stuck in the Langford's twisted little world. I thought about the last few months, the divorce, the charges, watching Judith's empire crack and Grant disappear. It hadn't been easy, but it was worth it. You ever think about her? Marina asked, her voice quiet. I took a slow sip, letting the question settle. Sometimes. Not like I used to. More like, wondering how I missed it all. She nodded, staring into her glass. Same. I keep asking myself why I bought her lies. I shrugged. She was good at selling them. That's not on us. Marina looked at me, her eyes steady. You're right. Took me a while to get that. We finished the bottle over the next hour, talking about nothing heavy, just dumb stuff like the best pizza spot downtown and whether the city's baseball team had a shot this year. It was easy, normal, the kind of night I hadn't had in too long. When she stood to leave, she paused at the door. Thanks for the drink. And, for not being an asshole about all this. I grinned. Back at you. She left, and I locked the door behind her, turning back to the window. The skyline stretched out, all possibility and no strings, and I felt something click into place. No more masks to wear, no more manipulation to dodge, just me, standing on my own 2 feet. I'd fought for this, clawed my way out of their grip, and it tasted better than the bourbon, sharp, real, mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't the outsider trying to fit in. I was just Brandon, free and whole, and damn, it felt good. I woke up the next morning with the sun streaming through those big windows, painting stripes of light across my new apartment floor. The bourbon from last night with Marina lingered in my head, just a faint buzz, nothing heavy, and I smiled a little, thinking about how easy it had been to just sit and talk with her. No drama, no lies, just 2 people kicking back. I got up, stretched, and made coffee, the smell filling the place as I leaned against the counter, looking out at the city waking up. It was Saturday, no plans, no one breathing down my neck, and that felt like a gift I hadn't earned yet. My phone buzzed on the table, a news alert about Tessa's case. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got me. I tapped it open and skimmed the headline. More charges added, something about tax evasion now, trial still weeks away. I shook my head, sipping my coffee. She just kept digging, didn't she? Part of me wanted to feel bad. She was alone now, no family bailing her out. But then I remembered the divorce papers on my plate, the secret accounts, Marina's hurt face. Nope, she'd earned this mess. I set the phone down and decided I wasn't going to let her shadow creep into my day. I grabbed my keys and headed out, figuring a walk might clear my head. Downtown was alive, people hustling to shops, kids laughing, street vendors calling out. I wandered past a little bookstore with a help wanted sign in the window and stopped. I didn't need the money, the settlement was plenty, but the idea of something to do, something normal, tugged at me. I went in, the bell jingling above the door, and a gray-haired guy behind the counter looked up from his newspaper. Morning, he said, friendly but gruff. Looking for a book or a job? I grinned. Maybe both. Saw the sign. He sized me up, not in a mean way, just curious. You good with people? Can you lift boxes? I nodded. Yeah, and I've got time. We talked for a bit. His name was Tom, owned the place for 20 years, and by the end, he handed me a paper to fill out. Start Monday if you want. $10 an hour, nothing fancy. I took it, feeling a little lighter. Sounds good. Back outside, I tucked the paper in my pocket and kept walking, the city noise wrapping around me like a blanket. I ended up at a park, sitting on a bench with a hot dog from a cart, watching pigeons fight over crumbs. It was simple, quiet, and I liked it. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from my lawyer. Settlement's final. Funds transferred. You're officially free. I read it twice, letting it sink in. Free. No more Langfords, no more Tessa, just me and whatever I wanted to make of it. I texted back a quick, thanks, then leaned back, the sun warm on my face. I thought about calling Marina, seeing if she'd want to grab lunch, but decided against it, not today. This was mine to enjoy solo. Later, I stopped by a hardware store, picked up some paint for the apartment walls, nothing crazy, just a soft gray to make it feel more like home. Back at the place, I cracked open a can, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work, the brush sliding smooth over the plaster. Music played low from my phone, some old rock I used to love, and I caught myself humming along. By nightfall, one wall was done, and I stepped back, hands on my hips, admiring it. It wasn't perfect, couple drips here and there, but it was mine. I cracked a beer, sat on the floor since the couch was pushed aside, and looked out at the skyline again. The lights twinkled, same as last night, but they felt brighter somehow. This was it, my life, my rules. No more fighting to fit in, no more shadows. Just a guy with a paintbrush, a job lined up, and a city full of chances. I raised the bottle to no one in particular and drank deep.